Hello, everyone. Thank you so much for joining us for today's webinar, supporting our pollinators with native and non-invasive plants. Just going to wait 1 or 2 more minutes just to allow folks to trickle in. Okay, it's now 12:02, so I think we can kick off today's webinar. So once again, thank you all so much for coming to our first Invasive Species Action Month webinar. I am Melanie, and I'm one of the youth engagement coordinators here with the Invasive Species Council of BC. And of course, I'd like to give a warm welcome to our guest speaker today, Dr. Elizabeth Elle. So I would like to acknowledge that we are all tuning in from many different parts of the province, from the traditional, ancestral, and unceded territories of many different bands and nations. I'm joining you all from Langley, where I'm very thankful to the Kwantlen, Katsi, Matski, and Semiahmoo First Nations, who have lived on and stewarded the land since time immemorial. As a provincial organization, ISCBC acknowledges the territories of the Indigenous peoples from across BC where we live and work to maintain healthy ecosystems for all. I'd love to hear where you're all joining us from today. So please feel free to introduce yourself and where you're calling in from today in the chat if you haven't done so already. And if you do have any questions during the presentation, please use the Q&A function towards the bottom of your screen, just so that we can keep track of questions coming in. They don't get lost in the chat itself. And we're going to try to get to as many questions as possible after our guest speaker presentation. May is Invasive Species Action Month, an action-packed month-long campaign to generate awareness and engage the people living in BC on invasive species and their impacts. This year, the 4 different themes are all about getting back to the basics. In a month-long effort to generate awareness about the threat of invasive species in BC, we'll share how to identify, report, manage, and prevent their spread. And this is important new information for some and a great reminder for everyone. This first week focuses on how to identify invasive species, including how to use helpful tools to aid in identifying a species you may come across. So before we begin today's presentation with our guest speaker, I'd like to share a little bit about the Invasive Species Council of BC, who we are and the work we do. So for close to 20 years, ISCBC has been addressing the threat of invasive species in British Columbia as the largest provincial invasive species charity in Canada. Our focus extends beyond local boundaries, encompassing education, outreach, training, and cross-border collaboration across Canada and international. As an organization, we prioritize organizing and uniting efforts and strive to spearhead behavior change in communities, organizations, governments, and industry. This includes coordinating research and sharing findings through conferences, forums, and webinars such as these. We're also a founding member and co-chair of the Canadian Council on Invasive Species. This allows us to collaborate on a national level, pooling our expertise with like-minded organizations to protect our shared environment. ISCBC's mission is to take action to build healthy landscapes and communities by focusing on education and promoting responsible practices. By spreading awareness and knowledge, we can prevent the further spread of invasive species and steward the environment for present and future generations. All right, so That is, thank you so much for listening to my little blurb on ISCBC and the work we do. So now I would like to get into our topic for today, which is supporting pollinators with native and non-invasive plants. Invasive plants can be as beautiful as non-invasive plants, but they have characteristics which cause harm to the environment and economy. Garden introductions were the source of several of worst BC invasives like Scotch broom, purple loosestrife, and butterfly bush, just to name a few. Some plants are actually touted as good for pollinators when in fact they are invasive species, and some of them aren't even very good for bees and butterflies. Today we'll learn about flower traits that pollinators find attractive and get suggestions for non-invasive species that you can use to support pollinators in your garden. And that's where our guest speaker comes in to share her knowledge on pollinators and plants. So with that said, I am pleased to introduce Dr. Elizabeth Elle. Elizabeth is a professor of biological sciences at Simon Fraser University. Her research focuses on drivers of pollinator biodiversity and the role of pollinating and other insects in natural, agricultural, and urban suburban landscapes. Her gardening hobby intersects with her work life as a conservation ecologist, resulting in practical advice for gardeners, land managers, farmers, and other interested in how everyday people can contribute to pollinator conservation. It's my pleasure to welcome Elizabeth as our guest speaker today.
Thank you so much, Melanie. I am really excited to be with everyone here today. As Melanie was just saying, this topic bridges my professional work as a conservation ecologist and my hobby as a gardener. I'm also truly honored to be participating in this webinar from the traditional and unceded lands of the Squamish, Tsleil-Waututh, and Musqueam peoples. They've shepherded the lands where I live and where I work since time immemorial. The Indigenous peoples of BC were really BC's first gardeners, and I honor their traditional knowledge of these lands every time I do my work. Anyway, I anticipate many of you are gardeners. That's why you're here, because you've heard that your garden can do important work supporting pollinators and other beneficials. And it's true that planting a garden is the #1 best thing that you can do to support those beneficial insects. My students and I have worked in natural areas, but also in gardens, documenting the flower choices of the bees, mostly in southern British Columbia. I've been watching where you say you're from, so I've got most of you covered. For those of you from northern British Columbia, I'm sorry, I will have fewer examples to support you, but I'm hoping that the advice I give today will help you look at flowers the way a pollinator does. And that will assist you in choosing really good non-invasive and native plants for your gardens. Gardens can be really important reservoirs for biodiversity of all kinds. And so I'm just grateful for all of you who are tuning in and wanting to support that biodiversity. So I'm going to share my slides now. And hopefully, there we go. Share. Okay, so again, thank you all for coming. I'm really excited. This is going to be fun. So a challenge for gardeners is that so many of the plants that are now considered invasive in British Columbia were introduced for cultivation. They were brought here by settlers, sometimes very long ago, sometimes because they were nostalgic for their homeland, like Scotch broom, or perhaps for medicinal usage, like comfrey and tansy. And sometimes because they had good landscape value, so many things were brought in because they're great ground covers. And now some of us are trying so hard to eradicate these. It's not even funny. And many because of their ornamental features, right? So they were brought in because they looked good, or sometimes specifically because they were thought to be really good for pollinators. The challenge, actually, let me go back. Okay, the challenge with that is that much of it, as Melanie said in her introduction, is not true. And the thing is, it's also not your fault, right? So a lot of these things are still being sold in the garden centers, which puts the onus on all of us that are wanting to garden to know more about what's invasive here in BC. It's why it's so great that the first thing the ISCBC is doing during Invasive Species Awareness Month is helping us all know what is invasive in our gardens. We ought to be able to recognize it because we have to be able to do that on our own. The garden centers are not going to do it for us. And one of the things that they sometimes make harder is that they're selling things for pollinators, or they're selling things suggesting that they're native when they're really not. And so when I look at all the photos of things I have here on this slide, the one I want to call out just briefly is bachelor's buttons. That bright blue might appeal to us, but I've never really seen anything visiting it when we've had it invading our field sites. It's just not that attractive to pollinators. These two photos were taken from the websites of two British Columbia seed producing companies. And I'm not going to call them out here, but I'm going to point out that both of them are sold as wildflower mixes that are supposed to be good for pollinators. And some of these things are wild somewhere, but many of them, if not, looking at the photos, probably most of them are not wild here in British Columbia. And so that's the challenge, is knowing what's safe and what's not. I'm hoping I can give you some good tips on that today during the next 30 to 40 minutes together. Okay, so what we're going to do is I'm just going to remind everyone what an invasive species is so that we're all talking about the same thing. I'm going to tell you what pollinators are looking for, give you a little bit of advice about when choosing native is a really good idea if you can do it. I have to bust the no mow May myth because it's May, and that one makes me a little nuts. And then I'm going to give you a few resources for the next steps in your own space. Okay. So an invasive plant, there's actually a spectrum of introductions. Not everything that is non-native is a problem. So there are introduced or exotic plants that have been brought by people outside of their native range. And a good example of this is highbush blueberry. It's farmed here in British Columbia extensively, especially in the lower mainland. It's native in the eastern half of North America, not here. Naturalized are things that are reproducing successfully outside of cultivation in the new region. So good examples are those lawn weeds, right? English daisy, white clover, they've been introduced. They are able to reproduce without help from us humans. But they're not in that next terrible category of invasive, which are the introduced species that are having negative ecological impacts. And I give a list of some of the some examples of garden plants that are in this category. And it's really important to focus on those ecological impacts, because when I talk to gardeners, they talk about something that's spready in their garden. Oh, I hate those English daisies in my lawn. They're so invasive. Well, technically they're not, right? They're not getting outside of a lawn. Or alternatively, they'll say, well, yeah, I have periwinkle, but it's not a problem on my property. It's like, well, again, that's not the point. The thing is, it's getting out of your property, maybe even just the things that you're cutting off, you're pruning off, and they wind up getting out into natural areas and causing a problem. So it's really about that ecological impact, not what's happening in your garden. That does make it a little harder for us that are gardeners. So again, hopefully I'm going to give you some good tools today. So what are common traits of these invasive plants that are becoming a problem out in nature? Well, the first thing is they're usually really great at capturing resources, whatever that is, water or nutrients, and definitely space. And so they're able to outcompete our native species. They form these big monocultures like this patch of Himalayan blackberry, and nothing much else can grow there. The problem with Himalayan blackberry taking over a spot like this, because let's face it, many of us actually kind of like eating those blackberries, is that it's outcompeting our native related species of rubus like salmonberry and thimbleberry, both of which bloom earlier and are important for migrating birds like hummingbirds to have as a nectar source in springtime. And so the cascading effects are not just on the plants that are being excluded from an area, but on the animals that use those plants. The other thing I'll mention about these invasive plants is they're often really effective at reproducing. So Himalayan blackberry spreads both by producing those fruits that we like, but birds also like to eat, and they wind up pooping the seeds out in new places, and it spreads to new places all the time, but also vegetatively, so they spread through runners. So almost all invasive plants have some of these particular traits. They can have other impacts besides competitive impacts, but I think it's the biggest and most important one for you to be aware of. So since I defined invasive, I think it's worth saying a little bit about native plants. So a native plant occurs naturally in an area without humans being involved in its movement. It has co-evolved with the local flora and fauna and in those local environmental conditions. This is why often a native species can thrive when an introduced species can't. Here in the Lower Mainland, especially, I think we're famous for trying to push the zones and grow things that really are not happy here in the Greater Vancouver region. The native plants are going to be better adapted to our climate and conditions. And they're, I'll bring up again why we have to care about that coevolution with the local fauna, which includes things like pollinators. Now, one of the challenges if you want to plant native is sometimes you can't get the straight species. You get what are sometimes called in the horticultural trade nativars. And I've got pictures of some plant tags of things I have planted in my garden that are not technically the native species. They're a cultivar of the species. So the classic is red flowering currant. It's such an amazing plant. It's great for early emerging bumblebees and for hummingbirds, and it's just beautiful plant, but you pretty much can't find the straight species. Most of us have King Edward. And that was a selection that was made because it made lots of more brightly colored flowers than some of the other varieties that were growing nearby. And of course, the horticultural trade wants to sell you things that are reliable in your garden, that are going to make you happy, and that they can propagate. And that's why we have these nativars. Sometimes it's a leaf trait, like in this red twig dogwood that has been selected and cultivated in those nativars. And the thing to know about a nativar is sometimes it's either just as attractive or even more attractive than the straight species. They're not necessarily bad, but sometimes they're less attractive. And that can be hard to know. It hasn't been studied for every nativar out there. I've read papers that kind of show depends on the trait. So leaf traits will affect things that would eat those leaves. Flower traits, given that we're talking about pollinators, will affect the pollinators that they're interacting with. So red flowering currant, this King Edward, it's fine. The hummingbirds and the bees like it just fine. But when you see a nativar, ask, is that what the flowers would normally look like in the wild, or will it no longer be attractive? And a good example of this is something I came across recently. I haven't grown it myself or studied it, but it's this camas selection. It's called semiplena. It has white double flowers. And the native species has these purple flowers that are single. They're not double. And one of the things about double flowers is often petals are kind of traded off against anthers, which have the pollen on them. And so you wind up having a less rewarding flower. It's a caution I want to give you, and I'm going to repeat this later, that if you got a cultivar of a native species that looks that different, it's not going to be attracting pollinators in the same way. It's unlikely to. Even though I haven't, again, studied it myself, I can pretty much guarantee that that's going to have a different level of attractiveness. So that's the thing to be cautious about with nativars, but otherwise, they're a good choice if you're thinking about planting more natives in your garden. Okay, if you're not sure if something is native, the best place to go is eFlora BC. This is out of the University of British Columbia. If you Google eFlora BC, you will find it. It has native ranges, because the reality is if something is native in northern British Columbia, it's not going to do well in the South Okanagan, right? So native in British Columbia or Western North America is not necessarily the most useful level of designation, given how variable the climates are across our province. Okay, so what about those pollinators? What are they looking for? So pollination is the movement of pollen from one flower to another, and it results in seed and fruit production. So pollinators visit a flower because they want food. They want pollen and nectar, and in the case of bees, this is the introduced honeybee in this photo. They bring the pollen and nectar back to provision a nest to feed their offspring. Anything that visits a flower has the potential to move that pollen from flower to flower and be considered a pollinator. And those pollinators, they don't care if a plant is native or invasive. This is a meme I see constantly. You need native plants for native bees. Well, I wish that was true. It would make my job easier, but I trust you guys to be able to learn about this. I know you're smart enough. They really honestly don't care. This bee doesn't care if that's introduced Himalayan blackberry or if it is another species of blackberry that is native to our province. It's got the same kind of flowers. It's got the same kind of plant chemistry. It doesn't care, sadly. That doesn't mean that bees get to have Himalayan blackberry, however. This is something that we should be trying to control at every opportunity. So as far as what we've got visiting flowers in British Columbia, again, anything that visits can pollinate in southern BC. We've worked in the Okanagan, in Metro Vancouver, and on Vancouver Island in the Garryoke ecosystem. And what we see is between 70 and 95% of the visits to flowers are done by bees. We have almost 500 species of bee in British Columbia. That's more than there are birds in the whole country. 20,000 species of bee in the planet. So if I slip and I talk about bees, it is because they're doing more of the work. Again, as I said, they're collecting the pollen and nectar to provision a nest. And so they visit flowers more than the bottom row of photos on this slide, which are all visiting just to feed themselves. So that's a mixture of flies and beetles and wasps and butterflies and hummingbirds. And some of those we really do want in our gardens. They provide pest control, or they're just beautiful to have around, but they often do less pollinating than the bees do. So again, I apologize if I say bee instead of pollinator. Okay, so how can we look at flowers the way pollinators do? These are flowers that are found at my various field sites. And when I look at these flowers as a pollination ecologist, I can make a pretty informed guess about what's visiting. And what I want to draw your attention to are the flowers that are excluding pollinators, because they're the ones that are going to support fewer pollinators and less pollinator diversity in your garden. And you can use this trick when you go to a garden store and you're looking to purchase something. So some of these flowers have a long tube, and the nectar's at the base of that tube. So only critters that have a long tongue are able to get that food. They exclude all others. Some of them have weird flower morphologies. I'm going to talk about this more on the next slide, and they're excluding anything but bumblebees. And some have markings that show that there's a proper orientation for visiting a flower. So like the fairy slipper orchid in the lower right, there's a particular orientation, there's a landing platform, and only one way to enter that flower. And the organisms that don't know how to follow those signals are not going to be effectively able to get any of the rewards out of that flower. So the ones with circles are excluding other organisms, and the ones without circles are more welcoming to all. Okay, so we'll come back to that idea of easy access flowers in a moment. First, I want to explain the ones that are excluding others. In general, they're supporting bumblebees, but not other things. So the first thing to mention is buzz pollination. Buzz pollination, you might be familiar with if you grow tomatoes and you've seen the bumblebees landing on the flowers and you hear like a bzz, bzz noise. They're like vibrating their flight muscles really fast. And that's because they are shaking the pollen out of the anther. So the pollen grains are inside the anther like salt in a salt shaker, and the bee has to shake it out by vibrating it. So that's true of tomatoes. It's also true of blueberries, which is why bumblebees are better pollinators of blueberries than honeybees are. Honeybees don't do this behavior. Shooting stars is an example of a native plant that has this morphology. So anything that is buzz pollinated, that's really all about bumblebees. Then there's a long floral tubes again. This is, again, the larger bodied bumblebees and some other related large bodied bees, or it can be hummingbirds and butterflies, because the long tube needs a long tongue. And anything that's a smaller critter, like a fly or a small bee, is just not going to be able to get the reward out of these flowers. And then the last one are those irregular flowers. So pea flowers, like on this lupin, I think we're familiar with what they look like. You can see what they look like in the photo. The bee actually has to push that open to get in and get the pollen out of it. And only a large-bodied bee can do that. You can see it really clearly on this turtle head in the lower right. That is a species that's native in the eastern North America, not here, but that bee's in my garden forcing her way in. The small bees just can't do that. So again, this is the group that's excluding others. Let's talk a bit about those that are more welcoming to all. And they're the flowers that I call easy access flowers. And the thing to notice is that there's no special morphology here. I tend to talk about the pollen being out there on a plate for everybody to access, right? They're welcoming to all. So these are, again, photos from my field sites. I'm going to give you more examples in a moment. But I first just want to mention that as a gardener, you should also be a little bit interested in how this kind of flower can also bring other beneficials, wrong way, to your garden. Ladybugs, lacewings, hoverflies, and wasps are amazing for aphid control. And it's usually the larvae that are doing the aphid control. The adults need nectar to eat. So having flowers to support these beneficials will help you deal with your pest problem. And again, they like the easy access flowers. Okay, so what are some good examples of easy access flowers? I like, in this next bunch of slides, I'm going to show you a combination of our native species and some well-behaved non-invasive garden plants. So the carrot family, the Apiaceae, is like the quintessential easy access flower. So on the left, there's all these native species of Lomatium. And you can see all the bees on them, right? So the pollen is just out there on a plate. It's like cake on a plate for those things to get. On the right, dill and cilantro are classically planted sometimes to attract beneficial insects to your vegetable garden. Let them bolt just a little. Let them make some flowers, because everything like this ladybug, and I've got a hoverfly, can get food from those plants. And below is Astrantia major. That's oh, I always forget the common name. Masterwort, which is in the same family and is incredibly attractive to pollinators. Another example of really easy access flowers is the aster family. I mean, look at them, right? We all know what a sunflower looks like, but sedum is another garden plant. Native plants here include blanket flower and yarrow. Yes, I've put the lawn daisy in there because we've actually found it's in our top 20 most visited plants in our study of gardens. The bee on the upper left, I'll just mention, is a specialist bee. We will return to her in a little while. But again, you can see the anthers. If you can see the naughty bits of the flower, it's going to be good for bees. And the rose family. So yes, roses are included. I've got 2 native roses pictured on this slide, but I also have salmonberry, I have a cultivated raspberry, and I have apple. All of these things are in the rose family. And you can see the anthers, you can see the naughty bits. And this is where I like to point out that some of the horticultural varieties that you might plant for other reasons, like a tea rose, are less attractive to pollinators. You can't see the anthers, right? You can't see those naughty bits on the flower. And so that's going to attract fewer pollinators to your garden. The heath family, the Ericaceae, I think we're all familiar with rhododendrons. I chose to include photos of our native rhododendrons on this slide. That's one morphology that's really common in the heath family. And the other is the one that we associate with heather. I also have kinnikinic on this slide, which is a native species. And Pyrus japonica is the one in the center top with a couple of mason bees on it. This is a well-behaved horticultural plant that I like to encourage people to include in their gardens because it blooms around the time that the mason bees emerge. And before your cherry and apple trees that you want them to pollinate are flowering. So it's great to keep them fed while you're waiting. Just going to throw in, because I'm assuming this is mostly a gardening audience, the things that are not attractive. I find that can really be helpful as well. So many bedding plants. So in our study of garden plants and what bees were visiting them, we found that things like marigolds, begonias, geraniums, which are really pelargoniums, right? Those like things like the Martha Washingtons and petunias, we really didn't see any visitors to. This is the problem with common names. Pot marigold, which is calendula, and the true geranium were very bee friendly. Think about what they look like. You can see the anthers. They're easy access flowers. I don't know why these bedding plants are unattractive. They're mostly exotic. I just think they probably don't have good enough reward, or the bees would learn to use them. And the other thing, as I mentioned before, when I talked about camas, anything that's got double or sterile flowers. Usually when they've been bred for extra flowers, there's a trade-off between the production of the anthers that have the pollen on them and petals. You make extra petals, you have less pollen, so that's less reward for the pollinators. So if you like any of these plants that are grown completely like horticultural varieties, then choose the bottom row if you want to support pollinators with your planting. Okay. And the other thing that you need to be thinking about is when are they blooming? So one of the challenges with invasive plant species is that they form these monocultures, as I mentioned, and that can reduce pollinator diversity simply because that monoculture is only blooming during a short period of time. So depending on where you are in the province, Himalayan blackberry will bloom for only a few weeks in June, sometimes July. And the challenge is that we have pollinators that are active at all times of the year. And so if it's only June that there's food available, it's a food desert the rest of the year when it's vegetative or even when it's got fruit. And we were able to demonstrate this very explicitly on a project we did for Metro Vancouver Parks, where they were removing Himalayan blackberry and planting diverse native hedgerows. And what we found is those diverse native hedgerows had something in bloom pretty much all the time throughout the year. And there was a 28% increase in the abundance of visitors to those flowers and an almost 20% increase in the species richness of bees, just because you had early where you can capture the mining and mason bees and late where you got things like digger bees and skippers. So think about the time things are blooming when you're planting a garden. In southern BC especially, we need things that are blooming in March and April because some of our pollinators are out at that time. Okay, so why choose native? Obviously, I'm not a purist. I've been giving you examples of both native and garden plants that are not invasive plants, and that's really important. Native plants can certainly be difficult to source, but I hope that you'll learn about and support the native plant nurseries in your region. The number one most important thing really is to avoid invasive species. In this corner of my garden, there's a big Douglas fir, which is native. The center species, this white thing here, assuming my pointer shows up, that's an ocean spray. I've also got some snowberry planted beneath it, and there's some herbaceous things kind of out of frame, including fall Solomon seal, fringe cup, and inside out flower, all of which, yes, are good for pollinators, but are also native species. I'm going to give you a few reasons to integrate native species into your landscapes. They can be beautiful plants, but I'd like to give you a little bit more than that to hang your hat on why it's important, because every step is important. I don't think you need only natives, but if we can all add a few more, that would be a great thing. So the number one reason that I like to mention to people is that you can be part of the solution when it comes to biodiversity loss. Habitat conversion is the number one reason that species are at risk worldwide. And in most cases, it's the conversion of habitat to agriculture. This is pit meadows, and so these are blueberry and cranberry fields. And I'm not dissing farmers. I worked with them a lot. We need them. We all want that food. And so that this is not a criticism of farmers. I just like to mention it because people think it's urbanization, and it's mostly not. However, we can be part of the solution by planting things both in the landscapes near agriculture, and I've worked with farmers on how they can do that, but also in our backyards that would support the native biodiversity that is potentially being threatened by this habitat conversion. We know that gardens are important habitat. The study I did with my student Julie Ray in the gardens of Victoria showed that those gardens had as much diversity as the nearby Garry Oak fragments did when it came to pollinators. And work by Kathy Martin almost 2 decades ago now, it's being repeated, which is great, showed that in urban and suburban areas where there were large trees and berry-bearing shrubs, you had more birds. So our urban and suburban landscapes can be really important reservoirs of biodiversity. A second reason to choose native species where you can is that some insects that are pollinators are also specialists. So what does that mean? They use pollen from just one plant genus or one family. It's not from one species. It's not that this one species of mason bee only uses this one species of plant. They're not that specialized, but they specialize on a group of plants, and that's because of the shared chemistry of those related species of plants. In British Columbia, the best estimate I could get was 85 out of 483 species are specialized. A whole whack of them on the Asteraceae. And this is where I'm going to mention this bee again. This is Coreopsis. It's native to Eastern North America, not here, but it's such a reliable garden plant. I have a lot of it in my garden. It blooms for a long time. This Melisodes bee is a specialist on Asteraceae, and I have got an awful lot of them that nest in my garden because they're getting the pollen they need. Now, I would like to see all of you also plant things like goldenrod and Douglas aster. That's something that I'm doing, but just know that even a related species of Asteraceae is going to be good for the specialist bees. That's also true for the bean and pea family, and I want to just call out willows. Willows are a great early season forage for bees. There are 12 species of mining bee that only use that willow pollen to provision their nest. Makes me want to plant a willow tree if I could only had room. Butterflies also have some specialized needs. We often think that to support butterflies, we need to plant butterfly flowers. And you'll see I put a little cross through that butterfly bush in the upper corner. That's an invasive species. Sure, butterflies will go to it, but they'll go to almost anything to get nectar. They don't really care what they get. They don't need that invasive species. You don't need special flowers for butterflies. What you need is caterpillar food. Plants are very well defended, and the fact that they have these chemicals that defend them from being eaten, since they can't run away, means that caterpillars have to have the ability to detoxify those chemicals in order to live on the plant. Plant chemicals that we like that are used for defense include things like nicotine and caffeine. And there's lots of different chemicals that we're using for our own uses, but they're really there to defend the plant. The anise swallowtail is an example I'll give. Its host plant is the carrot family. Carrot family is defended with chemicals called coumarins, and the caterpillars are able to detoxify those. Now, the anise swallowtail really would prefer to have those native species of Lomatium, but it'll take anything in the carrot family, Apiaceae. So you could also plant fennel or dill, but it won't make babies in your yard if you don't have something from that family for it to eat. Way more important than having a flower for that butterfly. And when I learned that I think there's 6 butterfly species that use stinging nettle as a host plant, I planted that in my garden too. Crazy. Okay. If you want to know what the host plants are, butterfliesandmoths.org. I think you'll remember that. Butterfliesandmoths.org will tell you what the host plants are. And the thing is, all caterpillars need host plants, not just the butterflies, which I think we tend to like because we like the adults, but all those squidgy little moth things too. All those caterpillars will need host plants, and they're important for feeding birds. If you like having birds in your garden, and you like having birds in the larger landscape, you can do your part by planting native plants that the caterpillars will eat, and then the birds will eat the caterpillars. They provide amazing pest control. And so if there are enough caterpillars for them to raise their young, they'll stick around in your yard and keep providing pest control even once their babies have fledged. It's been estimated that a pair of chickadees needs between 6,000 and 9,000 caterpillars to raise one brood of young. If you're interested in knowing about caterpillar host plants, in the US, there's something called the Native Plant Finder. You have to use the Seattle zip code in order to figure out what's best for your region, or pick another city that's closer to your region, like closer to the Okanagan, for example, and it'll give you some good advice. I'm going to give you some examples right now from that Plant Finder. So I picked some of the things that I'm telling you are really good for pollinators, and I looked them up to see what do they do in terms of being good hosts for butterfly and moth larvae, those caterpillars. Well, the Rosaceae, here we go again. Rubus, which is the salmonberry, the blackberry, thimbleberry, trailing blackberry, all of those, 110 different species of caterpillar use it as a host plant. 90 use amelanchier, over 100 use roses. So that's 300 species of things that can use these plants as a host plant. Some herbaceous things, I've mentioned solidago goldenrod before. It's not only good for pollinators, but it's the host plant for 59 species of caterpillar. Oh, you can get all of this information on that website, the Native Plant Finder. Now, some of these ideas come from a book that you may know about. Doug Tallamy has talked about the idea of a homegrown national park, and he's pointed out that all of us that are gardeners can compensate for habitat loss, which, as I mentioned, is the main driver of extinction. And I'm glad he's caught on. I've been saying this for at least a decade. There's some things about Nature's Best Hope that are really focused on the mid-Atlantic region where Tallamy works, right? But some of it can really be transported to the coniferous forests, which are, and as well as the grasslands and sage scrub that are what we see here in British Columbia. So I actually really like his advice. I recommend the book if this is something that interests you. First is to plant native species that provide food for pollinators and for caterpillars. If you can, I've given you some examples of what those plants might be. Reduce your lawn. I'll say a bit more about that in a moment. Remove invasive species, of course, because they're outcompeting the natives. And where you can, increase plantings of perennials. And the reason he says this is perennials, whether you're talking about trees or just long-lived herbaceous things, are going to be sequestering carbon. And talk to your neighbors. If you learn anything good today, I'll be really thrilled with that. Talk to other people about it. It's important. So speaking of lawns, I just need to say something about no mow May. I imagine, I can't ask you to put up your hands in this format, but I imagine many of you have heard of no mow May. And this cartoon is just so beautiful. I wish that if I stopped mowing my lawn, it would look like that. It doesn't, though. It's not full of all those beautiful flowers that are loved by bees. And my lawn is pretty, the little bit I still have is full of all sorts of things, but it's not this good, right? Stopping mowing doesn't necessarily suddenly increase biodiversity and suddenly become this great thing for pollinators. And the other piece of that is that sometimes the messaging is all about save the dandelions. It's essential early season food. And I look out the window and I see, at least in southern British Columbia, how much starts blooming in March, how many of our native species are blooming even. And I'm just so skeptical of the need for dandelions. And in fact, what we know from further work is that no mow May encourages the introduced species that are in this photo, but also some species that are considered invasive, like hawkweed. And it includes, and I should say, it also encourages the Eurasian grasses to get to reproductive size and to spread, which isn't necessarily a good thing. And it turns out that dandelions are actually really crappy food for bees. They're missing some essential amino acids. So when there are other things around, they're really not doing much for pollinators. So reducing your mowing frequency can be good. Right? So the scientific evidence is if you mowed every other week instead of every week, some of these lawn weeds would be available as food. But a better thing to do would be to replace some of your lawn if you can. Now, not everyone can. If you've got kids or big dogs, you're going to want some lawn, right? But maybe you can let it have some of these lawn weeds in it. Maybe you could have a little less of it. And I would encourage all of you to add early spring flowers to the garden. That's when the majority of our pollinator biodiversity is active, in April and May. And so if you can have more things in your garden that are blooming, that's going to do a lot more than stopping mowing. So I'll end just by pointing out some resources. I want to tell you to go to the Invasive Species Council of BC, and it's not just because they asked me to speak. Their Grow Me Instead guide is fantastic. If you like the look of something or you have it in your garden, like a butterfly bush or like bachelor's buttons, they've got a list of suggestions that include both native and well-behaved garden plants that you could consider replacing it with. There are also lists of invasive species that you should be considering removing. And in addition to the provincial invasive species council, there are local invasive species councils that highlight things that are especially problematic in their region. Make yourself familiar with these websites is so that when you're going to the garden store and looking for things to purchase, in addition to thinking about the flower morphology, and I would say just watching to see what the pollinators are visiting at the garden store in making your choices, you can also consider what's invasive in our province. The Xerces Society is a group that I absolutely adore. They are the Society for Invertebrate Conservation. They happen to be based in the Pacific Northwest, which is helpful, but they have region-specific guides for pollinators, plants that you can include, but lots of other information about what you can do in terms of, say, garden cleanup or making nest boxes, all sorts of information for supporting pollinators. And my lab website is a little clunky these days, but there's information on our local pollinators and the data from these studies in the different parts of the province, and the plants that we found had the most pollinators visiting them. So just to summarize what I've talked about today, please say no to invasive species. Obviously, you're eager to do that if you've joined us today. Say yes to well-behaved and pollinator-friendly plants when you can. Include some native plants in your garden that are bee food or caterpillar hosts. Nativars are okay, but make sure that if you're planting them for pollinators, that the flower shape is pretty typical for the species. Consider easy access flowers. Cake on a plate. Just remember, cake on the plate. If you can see the naughty bits, if you can see the anthers, that's going to be way better for a greater diversity of pollinators than anything that is excluding pollinators. And consider the flower timing. The series of photos on the bottom of the slide shows spring to fall here in the lower mainland of BC. If you have things that bloom at different times, you're just going to support a greater diversity of bees. And with that, I'd like to say thank you. I'm going to stop my screen share, and I see there's questions, and I'm going to try to answer some of those for you.
Thank you so much, Elizabeth. I learned quite a lot from this presentation, and I'm sure everyone else here at the webinar also did as well. And we do indeed have about 8 minutes for some questions. And yeah, I'll try to go in order from oldest to newest. So the first question we have here, so someone says, at some point, could someone talk a bit about a major source of invasives? Nurseries, box stores, grocery stores, and so on. How and by whom are these folks being dissuaded from selling invasives? I will speak a little bit about this later, but if you feel comfortable answering it now.
Well, I've asked the same question of the Invasive Species Council of BC, and so at some level, Melanie should answer this, but what they are planning on doing is launching an educational campaign to help the nursery industry better understand what is invasive in our region. And I'll say, as a consumer, I ask questions. To the extent you feel comfortable talking to wherever you're spending your money about your concerns that they're selling things that you know are invasive, and asking them, and do you have native plants and where are they, is a really good thing to do. But Melanie, are you the right person to add more about the upcoming educational campaign on this? Because I think it's relevant.
I might not be the best person to speak too much.
So I'll just say, I'll say stay tuned, because I was really excited to hear that this is in the works and it should be launched sometime over the next year.
Awesome. Thank you, Elizabeth. The next question I see, it'll pertain to a very quick little slideshow I'll do at the end. So I'm going to jump to Harold's question. Are the flower packs of seeds allowed to have invasive weeds included? This seems so with alfalfa seeds, and even it says pure seeds, they still include weeds.
Yeah, they do. So again, those photos I grabbed, those were from seed companies here in British Columbia. They're selling those so-called wildflower mixes, and there are invasive species in there. The two that I saw were bachelor's buttons and oxeye daisy. And so, yeah, there's the thing about invasive species in British Columbia is there is not a provincial law that prevents their continued distribution unless they're a noxious weed in an agricultural situation. So there's like a very tiny handful. So unfortunately, there isn't a legal rule, and that's maybe something that all of us can start to advocate for.
Awesome. Thank you for answering that. And our next question, with climate change, should we be looking to plants that are native south of us to expand range, maybe using eFlora as a guide? Oh, it looks like someone else just typed in an answer to that one, literally at the last minute. But do you have anything else to add to that, Elizabeth?
Yeah, the thing is that it's not just climate change isn't just, I hate the term global warming. It's not just that it's getting warmer. We're getting more extremes, right? So we've had things like the heat dome a couple of years ago. We had this crazy -15 in the lower mainland. And I know with that cold, towards the second half of the winter was throughout both BC and Alberta. We're having bigger extremes. And so, no, I don't recommend bringing things from, warmer gardening zones into BC. I've actually heeded the advice of some folks that have been talking to various garden groups lately and saying, no, we should actually be looking at plants from Manitoba, like things from like zone 5, because they'll be more resilient to the extremes. I think it's worth considering that we need resilient plants, not ones that just can deal with more warm.
It's a really good point to bring up. Yeah, thank you for highlighting that. All right, next question we have is from Terrell. I have heard that some rhodos have pollen that is toxic to bees. Is that true for the native species?
It's not true for the native species, and it's not true for like 99% of rhododendrons. There is one species of rhododendron from Asia, which I believe has not been brought into cultivation, where it's actually toxic nectar. And so it can make the bees, some bees that consume it, quite sick, but that is not true of any of the rhododendrons that are in the horticultural trade or of our native rhododendrons, luckily.
All right, that's good to know. And they have another question. It says, what about tree species that can support pollinators?
Yeah, thanks. I don't talk about them a lot, and I realize that's a bias because when we're out collecting bees, we kind of can't get the ones in the trees. As far as natives, our maples are amazing. Big leaf maple, vine maple. We don't tend to think of maples as being important, but just like willows, they have great nectar and they're early blooming. Any of the fruit trees are going to be amazing for pollinators, obviously, because they need a pollinator, right? So any kind of cherry or apple. That there's a lot of horticultural things that are also good for pollinators. I think you kind of have to watch, right? So things like magnolias, medium, because they're naturally pollinated by beetles. So we don't really actually see a lot of that here. But Stewartia, we definitely see a lot of things pollinating. So it'll depend. But as far as natives, most of our natives are wind pollinated, like alder and of course all the conifers, but the maples are really great for pollinators.
Awesome. All right, thank you. All right, we have a lot of questions pouring in. I don't know if I have time to answer them all. So
I'll
I
go
see some
quicker.
people have answered sent a couple of questions. So just so I can get a chance to get most people's questions in, I might skip a couple from the same people. So Heidi asks, is there a particular dill variety that you would like to recommend?
Any dill is going to be fine. And I see the next question is about yarrow. I think most yarrow varieties are suitable, although I personally see less pollinators on the red ones. I don't know why, but that's my personal experience. That's not data. In general, most of those flat top things are going to be really good. And I see Heidi's, is it okay if I jump ahead? Heidi's also asked about spring bulbs. I find that many of them are not that attractive. Certainly crocus is, it's really early. But I think and some tulips, but I don't see a lot of activity on daffodils. They did not show up as really important in our surveys in gardens. We found, and it might just be that early when those things are blooming, there's less pollinators active. So we just don't see them as much.
All right, awesome. And next question from Allison. Are there early flowering members of the aster family? Most seem to be summer and fall.
That is true. And now I have to work on my plant names. There is something that's planted early that has a yellow, it's called something like leopard's bane, right? That's a yellow Asteraceae flower. And I have a purple one. So yes, there are some, but I'm just not going to remember all the names right now. There's not natives that flower early in the Asteraceae, but there are some well-behaved horticultural varieties in that family. And then there's Bellis perennis, the lawn daisy, which you should encourage.
Good suggestions. Okay, I think we have time for one more question. Adjuga repens, yay or nay? I'm mispronouncing these, by the way, I'm sorry.
Yeah, Adjuga is a tough one. And some local invasive species councils are, like I understand the Sea to Sky group considers that to be invasive. It's certainly very spready in the garden and the bees certainly love it. So the jury's a bit out. I actually think I won't be introducing more into my garden at this time because I'm wondering if its status is going to change. Agasaki, yes, is a great plant. There's lots of great plants. If you're noticing lots of bees on something, trust them. Just listen to them, unless you know it's a listed species. If you're not sure if a species is considered invasive, like I see other questions about things like, oh geez, like oregano, there's probably others going down. If you're not sure if it's invasive, just check the Invasive Species Council website, and then you'll know.
Very good advice. Awesome. Well, thank you, Elizabeth. And apologies for those whose questions I didn't get to. Just in the interest of time, we don't want to go too much over time. So for the last couple minutes, I just want to share a couple slides about our PlantWise program, which might answer some questions some folks had about nurseries that might be selling invasive species. So hopefully my little bit talks to that. Is everyone able to see my screen, the PowerPoint? Excellent, excellent. So once again, thanks everyone for your thoughtful questions and discussions. So talking about the PlantWise programs. So yeah, as Elizabeth mentioned, many exotic plants in BC internationally introduced for their attractiveness in as garden plants, but these do escape the confines of the garden bed sometimes, and they'll become invasive due to a lack of predators and pathogens in their new home. And invasive plants do spread rapidly, and they can have severe impacts on our native ecosystems, ways of life, and our economy. So even today, a number of invasive plants are still not only sold in some BC stores and nurseries, but also through online plant sales websites, and this can further exacerbate the spread. So basically, our PlantWise program, this is a provincial program that supports the horticultural industry's transition to become invasive free. So we do reach out to some businesses and asking if they would be interested in becoming invasive free. Some reach out to us voluntarily. It's a completely voluntary program. But this program also provides a lot of handy information, not just for the horticultural industry, but for everyday gardeners to help make some smart decisions on non-invasive plant alternatives. Sorry, my slideshow is just all right. And Elizabeth already kindly mentioned our amazing Grow Me Instead guide. Thank you so much for that shout out. So this is one of our excellent PlantWise resources for both gardeners and for the horticulture industry. So we have physical brochures, kind of pictured to the left there. And we also have our online guide, which one of our staff is going to paste a link in the chat in just a moment. So this provides a list of common invasive species often found in our gardens in BC. And like Elizabeth mentioned, each invasive species provides a list of native and well-behaved non-invasive species alternatives. And it has tons of useful information, such as which zone in BC it can grow, how drought tolerant it is, benefits like it being deer resistant or bear smart, and of course, whether or not it is a good pollinator plant. All right, so if I do encourage folks to learn more about PlantWise, I've got some handy QR codes if anyone would like to take their phone and visit our websites. So learn more about that at the top link. And then on the bottom link, we also have a free PlantWise course if you want to learn more about how to make smart plant decisions in your garden, and also good for industry use. And I'd also like to talk a bit, touch on our theme for Invasive Species Action Month, which is identifying species. So I've got, again, some more QR codes if you'd like to download a great app I'm going to talk about. There's tons of apps that you can use to help with identifying species you may find. But one of our favorites is the iNaturalist tool. So what this does is you can take a photo of a species, plant, animal, doesn't matter. And if you don't know the ID, the great thing is that there is an AI feature that helps match up your photo to similar looking species. And even if you still can't get an identification, you have a community of citizen scientists on there who are happy to help ID that species for you. So this is not only a great way to contribute to community science, but it's a great way to brush up on your IDing skills. If you already have the iNaturalist app, that is wonderful. I encourage you to take it one step further and join the iSpy and Identify Invasives project. This is run by our friends with the Canadian Council on Invasive Species. By joining this project, it ensures that all submissions you make on iNaturalist within Canada are seen by folks in this community, and they could then identify any potential emerging new invasives. And who knows, maybe you'll even be the first one who makes that first detection of that new invasive species. So that is all the time we have for today's webinar. I really hope you enjoyed yourself and learned how you can make a difference in your communities and for pollinators by selecting non-invasive plants. So be sure to check out our Invasive Species Action Month page for more details on this month, and find some events happening around BC this month. And also we'll include a link to our store where you can get some awesome plant buy stickers and other fun swag. Next week, we're going to be focusing on the importance of reporting invasive species, along with some helpful tools for reporting. So be sure to join us again next week for another Lunch and Learn style webinar. That's going to be on Tuesday, May 14th, 12 p.m. to 1 p.m. We're going to be joined by Brian Heiss from Thompson Rivers University, who will be giving an update on invasive goldfish in BC. I'd like to give a huge thank you to Dr. Elizabeth Elle for so graciously taking the time to share her in-depth knowledge with us today. And of course, a big thank you to everyone here for attending. Enjoy the rest of your day, and thank you for joining us.